Roman citizenship. In the provinces, it was a mark of very high status, especially the eastern provinces, where not as many people yet had Roman citizenship. If Paul and Silas didn't have citizenship documents with them, which probably they didn't, at least when they were arrested, it would be on record for Paul in Tarsus. So, people could send to check it out, but in the meantime, you'd have to take their word for it. That was what the law required. Falsely claiming citizenship was a capital offense. So if you're about to be released, chances are you're not going to falsely claim citizenship and risk getting executed after they find out that you were not a citizen. Paul's family probably received citizenship as descendants of freed Roman slaves. I believe I mentioned earlier that Pompey, the Roman general in the first century BC, had taken many Judeans as slaves to Rome. Other Jews in Rome collected their money, they bought their freedom, and as freed slaves of Roman citizens, these Jewish people became Roman citizens themselves. So there were a large number of Jewish Roman citizens living in Rome. Many of them also left Rome, settled elsewhere in the Roman world, or went back to Judea sooner or later, as we see in Acts chapter 6 and verse 9. Some of the Libertini settled in different places and then came to Jerusalem. Well, Paul's family probably was descended from freed slaves, and anyway, for generations they'd been Roman citizens. So the Julian law forbade binding, putting in chains, certainly in stocks, or beating Roman citizens without trial. Maybe the jailer had informed them that citizenship was taken seriously in Philippi, and now they're going to call on it. Well, there are some objections that have been raised to Paul's citizenship. These are objections by those who tend to be more skeptical about Acts. Well, they say Paul never mentions his citizenship. Well, how strong is an argument from silence? That's not a very strong argument, since Paul attaches no intrinsic significance to Roman citizenship, even in the book of Acts. Paul avoids boasting except when compelled, and when he does boast, he boasts about his sufferings for the gospel. He's not going to boast about his Roman citizenship. That would be antithetical to what he's trying to accomplish in 2 Corinthians. It might be presupposed in Philippians chapter 1, verses 7 and 30, however, where he writes back to the church in Philippi, where many of the members, like the jailer, probably were Roman citizens. He writes back to them and says, you share in the outcome of my trial. Because whatever happens to Paul as a Roman citizen is going to set a precedent for other Roman citizens. He's before the emperor's court. That's going to set a precedent, and therefore it's going to affect them in Philippi as well. So Paul may not be entirely silent, but even if he were, it's not something we would expect him to talk about in his letters. Second, some scholars who are skeptical about the claim say, well, Luke is trying to establish Paul's high status. Well, yes, but just because he wants to establish Paul's high status doesn't prove that he's making it up. He might seek to establish it without seeking to fabricate it. Paul's Pharisaism is also high status in a Judean context, and yet in Philippians chapter 3 and verse 5, Paul himself declares that he was trained as a Pharisee. Well, they also argue citizenship was reserved for the municipal elite, and therefore it was closed to Jews. This argument misreads the evidence, and it misreads the evidence very badly. We have 1,173 Roman citizens in Ephesus' inscriptions. It was not reserved for the municipal elite. And there were various ways to achieve citizenship, including being freed as a slave. Thousands of slaves in Rome each year became Roman citizens, while it was difficult for officials in non-colonies in the Roman East. Some have also argued, well, Jews who were Roman citizens would have to participate in pagan practices, so Paul could not have been a Roman citizen. Again, this is simply false. Josephus and Roman Jewish inscriptions show that this is false. Philo shows that there's an entire community of Jewish Roman citizens in Rome. So sometimes the people who are skeptical of Acts are using information that has simply been made up. Sometimes it simply shows that they haven't done proper research when they're being skeptical. Fifth, Paul never uses the tria nomina, the three names of a Roman citizen, in his letter, unlike inscriptions. Well, only official documents required that. Inscriptions were seeking honor, Paul was not. Greek and Roman citizens in the East gave their names in Greek ways, most often. Of 50 Jewish Roman citizen inscriptions in Rome itself, for Jewish Roman citizens, none of them used the tria nomina. That's 0%. Further, this appeals to inscriptions. Letters were not inscriptions. Pliny, who's not only a Roman citizen, he belongs to the senatorial class. He's a very high-level aristocratic Roman citizen. In his letters, he uses only one or two of his names, never three, but often one. Correspondents often used just one in their letters. It's not surprising that Paul does that. Here is a stronger argument against Paul being citizen. Paul reports that he was beaten with rods. Citizens were not allowed to be beaten with rods. But Luke, who reports his citizenship, also does report such a beating. And Luke would know that citizens weren't supposed to be beaten with rods. Varys and other governors did, in fact, inflict such beatings on known citizens in places where they could get away with it. Florus, who was a governor of Judea, inflicted this not only on Roman citizens, but on equestrians, that is, on people of the Roman knight class, a rank shared by some governors when he was governor of Judea. So this argument, while it's a good argument, it's not a good enough argument. Well, why not reveal citizenship before the beating? That would yield a prolonged case with more bad publicity, because these people would have opportunity to speak back and say, no, these are still foreign customs. Officials could require certification from Tarsus, which would require a long time. Officials might finally decide against him anyway. But after the officials have violated the law, Paul has the upper hand. And it also may simply be that this provincial Jew didn't expect vindication until he experienced it later on in Corinth with Gallio, or until the Philippian jailer informed him that, Philippi takes these things more seriously than some other places. Well, what are arguments favoring Paul's Roman citizenship? Aside from the fact that Luke mentions it, and Luke knew him, which should be an argument in favor of it, but some other arguments as well. His name favors it. That is not a Christian special pleading. It's argued by Fitzmyer, who's a good Catholic scholar, but it's also argued by Gerrit Ludemann, who's an atheist New Testament scholar. So the name favors it. Nearly always, Paulus is a cognomen in inscriptions. When it was a prenomen, a first name, usually it was a reused cognomen from the family. People usually went by their cognomen, which Paul does. This was a respectable Roman name. It would suggest but not prove citizenship, but it was enough that many in the East would assume Roman citizenship. Paul got his Roman name from somewhere, and it wasn't merely for decoration in Jerusalem. The strong majority of people who used that name were, in fact, Roman citizens. Second, only a citizen could appeal to the emperor and then be sent to Rome. Well, this happened to Paul. His letters support on Acts at this point, although all of his letters were before or after the time that this happened. If we put them together, we have the clues that suggest it. Paul wanted to visit Rome. Paul expected Judean opposition. Those are both in Romans 15. Later, from probably Philippians 1, at least according to the way Philippians is usually interpreted, Paul is in custody in Rome. Well, how did Paul get into Roman custody? We have other evidence that Paul was in Rome. Well, he wanted to get to Rome. He expected trouble in Judea, and then he ends up in Rome. He could have traveled on his own, but he doesn't just end up in Rome anyway. He ends up in Rome in Roman custody. that he apparently got into somewhere else before he got to Rome. Further, Luke would hardly invent the lengthy Roman custody starting earlier in Judea than necessary, because chains and Roman custody were a matter of shame in the culture. People normally wanted to dissociate from people in chains or people in Roman custody. Luke wouldn't invent Paul's Roman custody, and Luke wouldn't invent it earlier than necessary. Luke wouldn't spend the entire last quarter of Acts based on a fiction, because the last quarter of Acts doesn't make sense unless Paul was arrested in Judea and then appealed to Rome, and that's why he's sent to Rome. And remember, this is the most detailed part of Acts. It's part of the we narrative with an eyewitness. This is one major reason why most scholars recognize, yes, Paul probably was a Roman citizen. Further, Luke's implicit information fits the claim. He speaks earlier about the synagogue of the freed persons, which includes freed persons from Cilicia, which would include Tarsus. And Luke wouldn't want to invent a slave background for Paul. If he's going to invent a background for Paul, it wouldn't be as a freed person. It would be, hey, why not, if you're going to invent honorable background, maybe he belongs to the equestrian class, like some high class, a few high class Jews in the municipal aristocracy in Jerusalem. Luke wouldn't invent the slave background, and Luke doesn't even specify Paul's the member of the synagogue, even though it seems to be implied by the context. Some supporting arguments: Paul succeeds in reaching Roman citizens in a way that most people wouldn't have done if they weren't Roman citizens. Paul also especially targets Roman colonies and ultimately wants to go to Rome itself, even before he's arrested. Paul's Roman name. I talked about this already in Acts 3:9 when it first occurs, but it fits Saul. Double names were very common. You find them in the papyri and the inscriptions. Greek-speaking Jews often had Aramaic and Greek names, but Roman citizens could add a signum, a Roman name. Actually his Roman name is his trianomina. The signum is probably his name Saul. But most concur that Paul's signum is Saul. And names often translate the meaning, or is here a similar sound. The trianomina, the nomen was the inherited clan name. The prenomen, which was originally the distinguishing name in the clan, there are about 30 of them used. Earlier, I think I mentioned that Seneca the Elder said he could repeat back 2,000 names in exactly the sequence in which he'd heard them. He may have a limited number of names to work with, but anyway, by the late Republic, only half of these were used. So they didn't work too well in distinguishing people, because you had so many people with the same name. So the cognomen became the new distinguishing name by the late Republic and early Empire. Paul lives in the early Empire. The cognomen started as a nickname, but in the Empire it was the primary identifying name. Often you could be named for your father or your ancestors. Paul was usually a cognomen and usually used only by Roman citizens.